to this edition of Virtual Gigliotti, where today we begin going over our World War II in 1945 class notes. And of course, at the start of the assignment, you'll notice that there are the things to know, the true and false in part one about 1945. So hopefully you were able to go through, use your prior knowledge to see which ones you felt were true, which ones you felt were false. Hopefully you were able then to go through the text to make sure that you could check your answer and then rewrite all of those statements as true statements, which give you a really, really nice overview of all the things you should know about World War II in 1945. So let's go ahead and have a look at some of the things that we're going to be talking about during 1945. So first of all, you're going to see that as 1945 begins, the war for Germany is essentially lost. There is no way, really, they are going to win or even be able to stop the Allies from invading Germany itself. Hitler, of course, refused to surrender, which is why the war goes on. But on the battlefield, the Allies were closing in. You can kind of think of it as sort of like a vice grip, if you know what that is. We have these two very powerful sides, and you kind of squeeze them together to smash what's ever in the middle. Well, Germany and the capital of Germany, Berlin, were in the middle of these two very, very powerful armies. From the east in 1945, you had the Red Army, the Soviet Union. The Soviet forces were rolling across Eastern Europe, places like Poland, and then eventually into Germany. And then on the western side, after D-Day, of course, the Allies had taken France. They had moved into Belgium, Luxembourg, eventually the Netherlands, and also then, of course, into Germany. So when you look at the first couple of statements here, by March of 1945, the Allies had crossed the Rhine River into Germany. So the Rhine is the border between many of those countries and Germany on the western side. And crossing the Rhine was significantly challenging. We'll be talking about that in one of the other videos. But make sure you know that the Allies were crossing the Rhine. And here you see some American troops from the Third Army. They built a little pontoon bridge to cross. Here we have the Soviet Army racing across Eastern Europe towards Berlin. They had perfected their own version of blitzkrieg. Lots of armor, lots of soldiers, lots of running. It's incredible when you watch some of these videos of the Soviet troops sort of running and keeping pace with their armor. Fascinating strategy, but their numbers were so vast. They usually outnumbered the Germans about 11 to 1. 10 to 1, so they just sort of overwhelmed them. And of course, by April of 1945, the Soviet Red Army is going to surround and capture the German capital of Berlin, and ultimately get to the center of Berlin where Hitler's bunker was. Then, of course, as 1945 progresses, one of the big events that happens is that Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States, passes away. And you might remember from your U.S. class, Franklin Roosevelt was a legendary president. He spent not only 2 terms, but actually won 4 terms in the White House, the only president to do that. And during his 4th term, he passes away right before Germany surrenders. So he never got to see the end of the conflict. His vice president for his 4th term was that gentleman right there, Harry Truman, who's going to play a huge role in how the war is going to come to an end. So in May of 1945, Truman takes over for Roosevelt and finds out that Germany has surrendered. Of course, even though Germany had surrendered, the war in the Pacific was still raging. And so in the Pacific, you're going to see some of the heaviest fighting in the history of the world out on many of these islands. For example, Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is a small island out in the Pacific. It's about 800 miles from Japan. And after a month of heavy fighting in March of 1945, American forces finally take the island of Iwo Jima. And you may have seen this very famous picture of the U.S. Marines raising the flag over Mount Suribachi, which was this enormous volcanic mountain on Iwo Jima. It's an iconic photo from World War II, and we'll talk about Iwo Jima in one of the upcoming videos. Iwo Jima was horrible, and then there was another battle about 300 miles from Japan on another island known as Okinawa, which might have been even worse, one of the worst battles ever, where the Americans lose about 12,000 men. One of the bloodiest battles of the war, fighting for this island not far from the Japanese homeland of Okinawa. And we'll be going into all the details in further videos, and you'll see it in the assignments as well. Japan, of course, refuses to surrender, even though they are clearly being pushed back further and further towards Japan, much like Germany had expanded and then been pushed back. The Japanese are dealing with the same thing. Their empire has been crumbling around them, but still they refuse to surrender, so Americans will start to plan the next step. After taking Okinawa, which would be the invasion of the Japanese home islands. I'm going to talk a little bit about Operation Downfall, Operation Olympic, what they called X-Day, which would have resulted in the death of probably around 1 million American lives. And so it wasn't something anyone really wanted to do. Unfortunately for President Truman, one of the other big things that happens in 1945 is that the top secret program known as the Manhattan Project goes ahead and builds the world's first atomic bomb. And we'll get into the whole Manhattan Project here in one of our next videos. But the Manhattan Project was the secret program to build the atomic bomb in the United States. The scientists worked for many years to produce it. They tested it. It worked. And so Harry Truman, finding out that this was another way to potentially end the war in the Pacific, authorizes the use of the atomic bomb. And two of them, like we'll discuss in a future video, are also are used against Japan, against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Eventually, that type of firepower forces the Japanese to officially surrender. And on September 2nd of 1945, this huge American naval fleet rolls into Tokyo Bay. The Japanese foreign minister was asked to come aboard the USS Missouri, which was this giant battleship. You can see the guns in the background, and sign the official surrender, while overhead hundreds of American planes buzzed Tokyo Bay just to show the people of Japan that they had lost and that the Allies had prevailed. So the war comes to an end in 1945, and we're going to be talking about all of those things in detail, but please make sure those 9 facts now are true in your assignment so that when you submit it, I can see that you've done all of those facts. All right, we'll see you next time here on Virtual Gigliotti. Talk more about 1945.